Okay. Good evening. This won't help me for this to be on my head because I need it to read. Good evening. This is where you're supposed to say good evening back. Okay. I am really glad to be introducing and literally introducing our colleague because I'm really interested in his findings around space sharing for religious organizations and groups. Dr. Paul Newmark, as you know, is trained in both theological studies and the academic study of religion. His research focuses on the social, civic, and theological implications of America's increasing religious diversity. An ordained Church of the Brethren minister, Dr. Numrich serves on the faculty of both MTSO and Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University, where he is professor of world religions and interreligious relations. He is a well-respected faculty member by students and colleagues alike, teaching courses such as Interreligious Relations, Multi-Religious America, the Comparative Study of Religious Ethics, and Perspectives on Buddhism. His leadership in this region regarding interreligious dialogue is invaluable. My side note is when we are talking as deans in a consortium, and we're talking about interreligious work, they say, ask Paul. So that's true. His leadership, he often has speakers from a variety of faiths come into his classes to have dialogues with students, and he encourages relationship building and dialogue among faith leaders wherever he is. Dr. Newmark holds a PhD from Northwestern University, a Master's of Divinity degree from Gary Evangelical Theological Seminary, and a bachelor's degree from Aurora College. His books include Religion and Community in the New Urban America. It's a co-authored. The Faith Next Door, American Christians and Their New Religious Neighbors. Sacred Assemblies and Civic Engagement, How Religion Matters for America's Newest Immigrants. His articles include When a Shared Parking Lot Isn't Just About Parking. It's recently published. The work he presents tonight is a result of some further research he has done while on sabbatical this school year. The Louisville Institute provided grant support for this research on space sharing, and it's good to have you back on campus, Dr. Newmark. Welcome, Dr. Newmark, please.
Thank you, Dean Bridgman, for that kind introduction. It's really good to be back. Last time I was here was commencement, and I live in Illinois, for those of you who don't know. When I came back on Sunday, I'm spending the week here, it felt nicely like coming home, my second home at least. I really felt at home. I didn't have to have a map out like I've been all year. Where am I supposed to be? And Google Maps and all that. I knew exactly where I was and where my favorite restaurants are. And it's good to see a lot of familiar faces. I've been to the Josephinum, I've been down to Capitol this week, and I'm seeing a lot of people that I treasure. Want to thank Kathy Dixon, who had another engagement tonight, for all of her work, and everyone involved in the Theological Commons. I think this is a great opportunity for us to present research and to share it and to get feedback. I want to thank Shannon Harper, who is here tonight, our tech expert, and I feel confident that she's here. I've told people I just came from a conference in Indiana where I wasn't confident about the technology, so I didn't do a PowerPoint. I'm doing it here tonight because I know it'll work. Well, space sharing principles for religious organizations and groups. This topic spans 2 centuries for me. Yes, back in the 20th century I started this. I didn't realize it, but in my graduate work at Northwestern in the late 1980s, I studied Buddhist temples, and there were what I call parallel congregations under the same roof, 2 very separate groups interpreting and practicing the same religious tradition in very different ways, And they didn't intersect hardly at all, so they were parallel. That's the first time I ran into groups sharing space. And over the years, I kind of, in the back of my mind was archiving the fact that I was seeing this. But only in the last 2 or 3 years have I started to be systematic about analyzing what's going on. In a research project like this, we gather data, and it's like a mountain of data with multiple peaks. This project, every case study is a peak on this mountain range of data. And we as researchers sometimes feel this is where we are in the mountain of data, just barely hanging on. That's where I've felt in the past year. I think today I haven't reached the peak where I've got the light bulb and I've conquered the mountain of data. I'm somewhere on the sides climbing up. While I'm here, I'm actually doing interviews on some Columbus sites, which I can't include yet in this presentation, so that's another peak of data. And so I'll be farther down on the mountain range after this week. And I'm going from here to Long Island to do another 10 days or more with sites there. So the data mountain is rising, and I'm trying to get a hold of where I'm at. Now, this space sharing is not just about religious organizations and groups. So let me share with you some headlines from some reports that have come out. It's everywhere, and in fact, everybody I talk to tonight, everybody in here could probably tell me about some space sharing arrangement they know about or they're involved with. But it's not just religious organizations and groups. So retailers are looking to help pay the rent by sharing their space with others. Office, workplaces, space sharing. Joint use agreements, these are school districts that share their space with outside entities. Hospitals, extreme makeover hospital edition. Dual purpose space where a hospital is sharing their space with some outside healthcare provider. Office space, medical doctors sharing with chiropractors. Okay, how does that work? So it's virtually everywhere. Now, how extensive is space sharing by religious organizations and groups? That's my specific interest. It's difficult to quantify. I spent a lot of time trying to quantify the overall phenomenon. Not many people are tracking this, even in denominations. You ask the person who should know, and they say, well, we don't know. There's a lot of it going on, but we don't know exactly how many. Some denominations are better than others at tracking, but to get a handle on the whole phenomenon is difficult. So just a couple of indicators. In this large study, National Congregation Study, half of the congregations in that study share their buildings with at least one outside group, program, or event. That's pretty significant. And just to take one group, if you go down in any major metropolitan area, you drive around, you see Korean signage outside of a church. There are more than 4,000 Korean Christian congregations in the U.S., and the majority of them worship in non-Korean churches. That's just a couple of examples. This is how extensive this is. Now, you can slice up this data in many ways. Very basic, you can look at who owns the space or the property. So I've got two major categories or types of space sharing according to proprietorship. So single proprietorship, one entity legally owns the shared space, and the other is joint proprietorship, where at least two or more entities legally own the shared space. So I'm just going to share with you some of my primary research sites, and I'll use these throughout to illustrate my points. So under single proprietorship, Heartsong Church is in suburban Memphis. I'm going to circle back to this picture. Let me say a little bit about Heartsong. It's a United Methodist congregation. Its current pastor characterizes it as an evangelical progressive congregation. The previous pastor called it a Jesus-following tribe and a 21st century Jesus freaks congregation. Heartsong opened its main space rent-free to the Memphis Islamic Center for Ramadan prayers a few years ago while the facility for the mosque was being completed. In this picture, you can see here's the women lined up for Ramadan prayers. See the cross prominently in the back. I'm going to circle back to that later on. The two congregations recently formed a foundation with other local partners to build what they're calling a friendship park on a plot of land adjacent to the two properties. Another case, Harrisonburg Mennonite Church. I have a connection in Harrisonburg at Eastern Mennonite University. So Harrisonburg Mennonite Church is in Harrisonburg, Virginia. A very large facility, and it's used by multiple groups, both religious groups and non-religious. So among the religious groups that use this site is a Lao congregation and a Hispanic congregation, both Christian. And then under non-religious users, there's an adult literacy organization and the Rotary Club, so fairly typical. Pico Union Project in Los Angeles, it's walking distance from the Staples Center. Very interesting site. You cross the viaduct, you go into a different area in Los Angeles from the Staples Center. But this is a nonprofit corporation, but is not categorized as a religious nonprofit under California tax categories. So it's not a religious nonprofit. Even so, it's informed by Jewish beliefs and traditions. It describes itself as a multi-faith cultural arts center and house of worship. It's been used by non-traditional Jewish gatherings, 3 Christian congregations, 1 African American, 1 Asian, 1 Central American, and various arts and community groups. I mentioned I'm going back to Long Island. I was there in November. I've got several sites on Long Island. The current nor'easter will be out of there by the time I get there. So I can't give the names of some of these at this point, but one of the sites is a mainline Protestant church that has a mainline synagogue using its facility. There's a Wesleyan Holiness Church coming out of that tradition, and a non-denominational synagogue uses its facilities. There's a mainline synagogue, to flip it, that owns the facility, and a Hispanic fundamentalist church that uses it. And the main one that I will talk about tonight is Ministerio Jesu Cristo Vive and Temple Beth Shalom. This is the website of the church, and you probably can't see it, but in the back is the sign out in front, and it still has Temple Beth Shalom on the top, and yet Temple Beth Shalom no longer owns the facility. They haven't changed the sign. The JCL, Jesus Christ Lives, in English, is down below. You can see that. This is an interesting site. The church is a non-denominational, full gospel congregation. Its membership is made up of multiple Spanish-speaking groups. It first rented the facility from the synagogue, but then bought the building when the synagogue became financially strapped. The synagogue is self-identifies as on the far left wing of conservative Judaism. The church now, that's how the rabbi described it, just quoting, the church now allows the Jewish congregation to use it rent-free. Rent-free. It used to be, they used to own it, now they use it rent-free, though the synagogue does pay for utilities. I'll come back to that. Airport chapels, shared space. I'm studying 3 cities, airports in 3 cities. This is from JFK. I've done quite a bit of work there. This is the Protestant chapel at JFK. This is complex. Who's the proprietor here? It took me a while to figure it out. New York City owns the land. The city leases the land to the Port Authority. The Port Authority leases the building to Terminal 4. Terminal 4 leases space to 4 chapels, charging only for services, no rent. So there are 4 chapels. 3 of them are dedicated chapel spaces. So 1 for Catholics, 1 for Jews, 1 for Protestants, and this is the Protestant one, as I said. The 4th chapel at JFK Airport is labeled multi-faith chapel, but it has become the de facto Islamic chapel with a partitioned area for other groups in the back, especially Sikhs. In Columbia, Maryland, there are interfaith centers. Now we're getting to this other category of joint proprietors. This is the Meeting House, the name of one of these interfaith centers. I don't know if you know about Columbia, Maryland. Some of you know about urban development. Back in the 60s, this was one of the planned suburban communities. Standalone congregations were discouraged by the land developer. He thought they were terrible uses of land, very inefficient. So he discouraged standalone congregations. If you're going to start a congregation here, you have to be in one of these interfaith centers. So 6 of them developed in Columbia, Maryland. This is between Baltimore and D.C., by the way. The Meeting House, the one that I have on the screen, has 5 partner congregations that own and operate this single site. 2 synagogues, a Baptist congregation, a United Protestant congregation, and a Catholic parish. And they have many renter groups, both religious and non-religious, that use the facility. So another joint proprietor case, the Tri-Faith Initiative of Omaha, Nebraska. There's the plan there. You probably can't see it. But 3 congregations co-located to create an intentional interfaith campus in Omaha. There are dedicated buildings for Jewish, Muslim, and Protestant congregations. So here's the Protestant, there's the Muslim, and there's the Jewish. There is a plan to construct a shared tri-faith center. That's proposed here. It hasn't been built yet. And then the commons area in the middle, that will include a bridge and walking paths connecting all the buildings. All of this will be overseen by a board of representatives from each congregation. And the last of my selected sites, Bereshith of the Midwest, that is a pseudonym. In the 1970s, a Reform synagogue and a mainline Protestant church created a nonprofit corporation. I'm calling it Bereshith. How's your Hebrew? Bereshith of the Midwest. And this corporation owns, maintains, and improves the shared facility. So I've promised 5 principles. You didn't know it was going to be 5. 5 principles for a mutually satisfactory space sharing arrangement. Here are the 5, and I'll unpack each one. First one has to do with purpose or purposes of the sharing, legitimate uses and users, the fair treatment of the sharing parties, 4th, communication, and 5th, conflict resolution. So the first principle. And now I'm going to use a couple of quotes here from non-religious sectors to start out, then I'll go into my religious cases. I'm trying to make a case here that a lot of this space sharing with religious partners is similar to any space sharing. So the first principle, determine the purpose or purposes of the space sharing arrangement. Know what you're getting into and the cost and benefits from the beginning. So a quote here, small businesses, living together isn't all sunshine and roses for people or businesses or religious groups, right? Don't rush into anything. You should solve more problems than you create by doing this. So know what you're doing from the beginning. Think it through. These pop-up shops, I don't know if you know about them, but a guide to pop-up shops. You've got to get your goals, your budget, your outcomes all decided on before you get into this. And it's the same way, my principle is the same for religious space sharing. So from some of my cases now, there are one of the questions I ask in my interviews is, why? Why are you doing this? And it sorts out to 2 types of answers. One is practical reasons. So it might only be about the money, right? We need rental income, or we can't afford to build our own site, whatever. It might only be about the money in religious space sharing, and if so, own that fact. That's okay. But I'm finding this is really not the norm. In another large national study of congregations, only about 1/4 reported rent as one of their largest sources of income. Only 1/4. So it's not just about the money. In fact, I don't think most of the time it's just about the money. Other reasons include interfaith dialogue. And so in several of my sites, the key purpose of the space sharing is to promote interfaith dialogue and relationships. So the Tri-Faith Initiative, even in the name, the Meeting House, the Bereshith of the Midwest, they all primarily have to do with interfaith relationships. But that is not the case always. And so I'm coming back to this case of Jesu Christo and Temple Beth Shalom on Long Island. I chose this case because these two congregations are very different theologically. The pastors, these are the two pastors, it's a couple, honor and support the synagogue because the Jews were God's first chosen people and still have a special relationship with God. The church gives its Christian testimony through loving actions, respect, and honor, not through preaching, allowing the Holy Spirit to use this space-sharing relationship, hopefully, to bring the Jews to Christ. That is their ultimate purpose. Now, Beth Shalom, the Jewish partner, entered into this arrangement because the church made them the best offer for this site. That wasn't it. That wasn't all. They treated them with dignity from the start. One of the other bidders from the start did not treat them with dignity. Okay, I won't go into all the details, but this church made a good offer, best offer. That wasn't the only thing. They treated them with dignity from the beginning. Now, some of the synagogue leaders that I interviewed are baffled that the church declines to participate in any interfaith activities. There's a local interfaith Thanksgiving service. You find this all over the country. The church will not participate in that, and the synagogue leaders can't figure out why. The church's theological position is that they can, quote, break bread with any group, Muslims, anybody, for beneficial activities, social benefits to the community or whatever. But the church will not participate in interfaith worship or even ecumenical worship with Christian groups that are incompatible with its beliefs. So they will not join with Catholics, for instance. Okay, well, a couple of brief points about this first principle of determining the purposes of the arrangement. I do not believe that all parties have to buy into a common mission or vision. Some of the literature says you've got to have a common mission or vision. I don't think so. I think it can work without that. I think it's okay to have an opt-out provision from the start. Not exactly a prenuptial agreement, right? But what happens when you're ready to opt out? I think you should think about that from the beginning. At some point, the partner groups might feel stuck with each other, given the costs to dissolve an arrangement. So I think you should think about that from the start. So, principle 2, specify the legitimate uses and users of the sacred space. So a couple of quotes from non-religious sources. The joint use agreements, this is public schools allowing other entities to use their facilities. So the joint use agreement lets you define, this is a guideline, let you define who will use the facility and, of course, who won't, right? I've got quotes, several quotes here from what's called commons management literature. Thanks to Randy Litchfield for getting me onto this literature. It's a really perfect fit for what I'm doing. This is a quote, it's a little, quite a bit of text here, but from Eleanor Ostrom, who is kind of the main voice in this commons management. Much of that literature focuses on sharing natural resources like fishing grounds, but what I'm looking at is sharing resources as well. But look at this quote, in terms of specifying uses and users. The boundaries of the system, as well as who has property rights, must be clearly defined, and this includes establishing boundary rules. Who can enter, who can harvest, manage, and potentially exclude others. Think about religious groups. You have to determine who can use your space and who cannot. Okay. I think, so now drawing from my religious cases, I think these agreements can be formal or informal depending on the situation. It's certainly been the case in my research. I don't agree with those who say there must always be legal documents. I think it just depends. The Memphis case, remember the Memphis case, they let the Muslims use the space for Ramadan. It was informal. One of the Muslim interviewees that I talked to said it was sealed with a hug. not just a handshake. That deal was sealed with a hug. It gives you an insight into that relationship. But that relationship became more formalized as they've gotten into this proposed friendship park. It's become more legal documents, so it depends. I think agreements can have different terms for different groups. The Harrisonburg Church that I mentioned before charges rent for some groups, not for others. It also excludes certain groups. Non-Christian religious groups are excluded from the Harrisonburg Church, contrast to that to the Memphis Church that allowed Muslims to come in. So no non-Christian groups can come into this other. Neither can fraternal organizations use their building, or any group that has purposes inconsistent or incompatible with the church's purposes. So again, defining who can use this space, what's legitimate use and users. Rules are important. Again, the Harrisonburg Church has a written set of rules. So, for instance, no smoking or alcohol on the premises, no food or beverages in the sanctuary. But Ministerio Jesu Cristo Vive has no written rules at all about the use of the building, and yet the parties, the Jewish party and the church, seem to get along just fine and know how to use the facilities properly with no written rules. Scheduling needs to be dealt with. Scheduling procedures, I've run into groups that use Google Calendar. Didn't know it existed. I don't use it, but they seem to find it helpful. Double booking causes problems. Not just with religious groups, right? You know that. So that's important. Now, three spaces come up a lot in my research. Parking lots, mentioned earlier that I've got an article out on parking lots. It's kind of interesting. Parking lots come up a lot. Sanctuaries come up a lot. Kitchens come up a lot. Kitchens, I could do a whole night on kitchens and parking lots. But I want to do sanctuaries because, oh well. So talk about sanctuary space. There are a couple of types. There's dedicated space and convertible space. I was looking at this space, and I was saying, is this a dedicated space? Dedicated space is, you walk in, you know it's one religious group. You see that group's symbols, and sometimes they're actually fastened down so you can't move them. This is mostly convertible, right? Most of the Christian symbols in here can be taken out, and that stained glass is not particularly Christian. The organ, some groups might come in and say, oh, it's Christian, there's an organ here. But still, you get the idea. Dedicated space, you walk into the Catholic chapel at JFK, and it's a Catholic space. And those of you who have been to the Josephinum, to their chapels, those are dedicated Catholic spaces. There's no doubt there, So, but there are convertible spaces, and several of my sites are like that. So the Meeting House in Columbia, Maryland, everything is carted, literally carted in and out. I sat there on a Sunday morning and saw the Catholics carted their stuff in, and then the Baptists carted their stuff in, and then the Catholics carted their stuff back in for the next Mass. And that's how it works there. There's a trade-off there because it's never any one thing permanently. These are some of the trade-offs. But it's convertible, so all different groups use it. Bereshith of the Midwest has a brilliant setup where the sanctuary has a neutral mode when you walk in, and then you can flip the panels very quickly and it becomes a Jewish space, and flip the panels again and it becomes a Christian space. It's brilliant. Now, back to this. Heartsong Church. Remember, here are the women, Muslim women for Ramadan prayer. There's a prominent cross, fixed cross, that stays there. Now, Heartsong has never called this space a sanctuary or sacred space. They call it a multi-purpose space or the celebration room. As the pastors like to say, if Zumba classes can meet there, why couldn't Muslims pray there? The current pastor told me, this space is no more sacred than the rest of the planet. If Heartsong burned down tomorrow, we would have amazing worship out in the parking lot. Well, that's not all of the story, because on both sides of this relationship, there were critics. So some Muslims in town questioned, why aren't we using another mosque? Why Why are you using a Christian space with a cross for our Ramadan prayers? And on the church side, they lost 20 members over this. Well, the Presbyterian Church USA has a nice document about sharing space, and they warn about emotionally charged decisions about religious symbols. Worship spaces are potential flashpoints. Okay. Principle 3, treat all sharing parties fairly. Joint use school partnerships. No simple matter. In this study, the interviewees from all these cases emphasize the importance of a strong, positive, trusting relationship between partners. Again, from the commons management literature, resource regimes that use this principle should be able to craft rules to fit local circumstances, rules that are considered fair by participants. There's always the possibility of unequal treatment of the sharing parties or the abuse of power, for instance, by the proprietor. There should be buy-in from all stakeholders on the particulars of the space sharing arrangement, so it's not perceived as imposed by one group or the dominant group on the others. All stakeholders should have at least a voice in the sharing, especially in setting the rules for the space use. They have a voice, they may not have the final vote, but at least a voice. The two congregations of Bereshith of the Midwest, the Jewish and Protestant Christian, began as equal partners, but as one congregation grew, the other did not, and so they became unequal users. They were equal partners in owning and operating, but unequal users of the shared space. And so this and other factors led to conflict, with feelings of unfairness in bearing the financial load, as you can imagine. Well, the congregations recently worked out an equitable cost-use agreement and established a mechanism to evaluate that agreement after 1 year. And the individuals I interviewed all agreed that the conflict has subsided now. The Meeting House in Columbia, Maryland, has a complicated cost-use formula based on size of congregation and utilization of the facilities. The formula was devised after the mortgage was paid off several years ago and works well now because it is auditable, one person explained to me. It can be audited. Everyone can see what's been used and how much has been charged. Ministerio Jesu Cristo Vive and Temple Beth Shalom do not share any significant norms, values, or local history, and they directly interact only occasionally, but the church has been such a caring and congenial host to the Jewish congregation that strong feelings of regard have been forged. The rabbi told me that the church has never made the Jewish congregation feel like strangers in their own home. And the church has shown remarkable sensitivity to the use of symbols in the building. Another interviewee from the synagogue told me about the time that synagogue members came to the building and found church members thoroughly cleaning the building and asked them why. And the church members replied, "It's the high holy days. We have to get the synagogue ready." Think about this. This is the church. They own the building, but they came to get it ready for the synagogue to use. The church has been super sensitive to our needs, very respectful for our needs, according to this Jewish interviewee. Principle 4, develop clear channels of communication. Use them with optimal frequency. Communication is no less important when religious groups are involved. Oftentimes you have cultural and language barriers that must be taken into account. When an immigrant church worships in an Anglo church and so forth, cultural diversity within a congregation calls for communication skills. Communication is important no matter what the context. So if you look in non-religious sources, this is airport concessions. You know, they're sharing space in terminals, right? And so this manual talks about periodic, it doesn't say frequent, but periodic meetings, one-on-one, so that everybody's on the same page and clarify uncertainties. Property management folks, all right? Ownership should communicate with residents and channel behavior. Back to religious cases. Theological differences between groups may increase the need for clear communication. So if you have a conservative congregation that rents from a liberal church, for instance, or groups from different religious traditions that share a facility, sometimes theological and cultural differences overlap. But whether or not religious groups are involved, there is no standard formula that I can see for the frequency with which groups should communicate. In some of my research sites, face-to-face meetings occur regularly. So at JFK, the airport chaplains have lunch once a month. They meet with the terminal manager once a quarter. But other of my sites feel little need for regular communication or even much interaction of any kind. So I think the rule of thumb here is whatever works, works. So the last principle, establish effective conflict resolution procedures. It's okay to tell someone when they are violating your space. You don't have to be mean about it. So what's effective, about resolving procedures? Again, back to commons management. You need simple local mechanisms to get conflicts aired and resolutions that are generally known. Conflict is inevitable in any space sharing agreement. So it's not a matter of avoiding conflict, but establishing effective procedures for resolving it when it occurs. Now, many of the religious people that I've interviewed are reticent to apply the term conflict to whatever happens, the disagreements, the snafus, the annoyances that they experience. And in fact, in most of my cases, it's minor stuff and, resolved very quickly on the ground. The major conflict at Bearsheath of the Midwest was one that really was not about minor issues. For many years, they prided themselves that they had never used the resolution committee that was actually set up in their bylaws until this recent conflict took place. And so they created a new functional committee to address the issues and to resolve them. Back to one of my sites, another one of my sites, the Pico Union Project in Los Angeles. It's dedicated, quote, to the Jewish principle to love your neighbor as yourself, end quote. The project's facility manager was taught this principle growing up as a Christian, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. It's in both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. But he never saw it as a guideline for everyday life. He told me he left it in the pew. He was taught to love your neighbor as yourself growing up, and he left it in the pew until he became the facilities manager at Pico Union Project. Now he invokes it in dealing with any issue that may arise, including conflict. All right, let me finish up with what I've been thinking about most recently. As you can see, I've been illustrating throughout with quotes from non-religious sources. There's a lot of overlap anytime you share space. Think about your home. Do you share your space at home with somebody else? Well, you got to figure it out, right? You got to deal with how to share it. So assessing the religion factor, I'm on record. I don't want to make too much of religion, right? And I'm also on record in another place that many religion scholars like me tend to think religion is more important than it is. So I don't want to make too much of religion. I want to know what is the religion factor here? What ways does religion matter in space sharing? And then what larger lessons can we draw from these cases? So just a very few thoughts about this. How does religion matter? Okay, and the larger lessons. So first, space sharing usually, or at least often, has religious purposes in these cases. Whereas in business, it's always, or at least usually, about the money. Okay? The CEO of the Pico Union Project cited religious values underlying his organization. Remember, this is the the nonprofit that's not listed as a religious nonprofit under California statutes. But the CEO talked to me about the religious values that underlie the Pico Union Project. He talked about grace, neighbor love, sanctuary, which he defined as a safe place for different groups to get to know each other in order to love each other. He talked about acts of righteousness, obligation to pursue justice, all religious values. A leader of Bereshith of the Midwest was talking with me, and we wondered, how does your religious space sharing organization differ from Walmart? Walmart's arrangement with its what they call independent service operators. Okay, my local Walmart, I go in and I see all these independent retailers in there, you know, for jewelry and sandwiches and so forth. They have these space sharing arrangements. So I asked this officer of Bereshith of the Midwest, how is it different? And this person said, we differ in our mission or our vision. We're giving a model for the world of sacrifice for the benefit of our partner. And that's not in Walmart's calculus. Okay, that's my first comment about the religion factor, how it matters. Secondly, religious symbols and sacred spaces can matter a great deal. Again, I think it depends on how the groups define sacred space, okay, as we've seen. But consideration always has to be given to the potential symbolic meaning and emotional attachment to a particular space. In non-religious contexts, a space may not be considered sacred, okay? But it may have special or proprietary meaning to certain individuals or groups who would be offended by illegitimate uses or users of that shared space. And we can only think of just one example recently, Confederate statues in shared public spaces. Okay? I would not call those sacred spaces, but they're shared spaces. And the turmoil over what those spaces mean and those symbols and who has the right, to be there and the right to understand their legitimate meaning and so forth. Sacred space and other kinds of proprietary or special spaces, I think, have some similarities in the emotion that's attached to them. Okay, thirdly, at its best now, at its best, religion does well in treating all sharing parties fairly. I have heard many testimonies of fair and hospitable treatment. This is one of the unexpected joys of this project. The inspiring vignettes that I hear over and over again, how groups have been treated fairly, unexpectedly by a partner. This would resonate in any context. Sensitivity to the other can be a powerful force, especially in context with majority-minority group dynamics. So any minority group would appreciate the kind of sensitivity shown by Ministerio Jesu Cristo Vive to Temple Beth Shalom on Long Island. And lastly, again, at its best, now religion has resources that can contribute to effective conflict resolution procedures. Back to the manager of the Pico Union Project in LA, a Christian who puts love your neighbor as yourself into practice, raised that it was just a saying, now he puts it into practice in resolving conflicts and just managing this shared facility. That approach has potential to resolve conflicts in any sector, religious or non-religious. Okay, just want to point to you the online forum that's been set up by Danny Russell here. If you want to go there, you can see people have shared their stories about space sharing. It's a 3-part forum. You can go there. You can actually contribute to it or have others contribute to it. I wanted to clue you in on that if you didn't know about that already. And then this is just thanks to the board here and the board of Trinity, which is now part of Capital, for facilitating this year. It's been wonderful that I've been able to do this research, and also to the Louisville Institute for the grant support that has allowed me to do the traveling. So thank you very much, and interested to hear your thoughts. Would you entertain questions? Oh, we have lots of time for questions, And so I'm hoping this is a way to get feedback and criticisms and anything that you want that can help me and help all of us to understand this. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Paul, this is very, very interesting. What I'd like to know, maybe to start off with this, is in the history, okay, thanks, Shannon. Okay, my question is, in the history of the use of religious buildings or even public buildings, how common is the sharing of space? Is this a new phenomenon? And if it is, what do you think is causing it?
Yeah, it's not a new phenomenon per se. I mean, you've got, depending on how broadly you define space sharing, I mean, you've got space sharing that goes back quite a ways in different contexts. What I'm seeing here, the amount of space sharing has increased, and has a lot to do with various factors, demographic factors, a lot to do with immigrant groups, refugee groups, groups that can't afford their own facilities. That has increased dramatically. What may be not so common in the past, but more common now is the sharing across very different groups. That's still a small percentage, a smaller percentage than others, but important. So when you've got, say, Bereshith of the Midwest in the 70s, so it goes back a while, building a shared facility, that's pretty important. So, I mean, I can't give a full answer to your question. It's not a new thing. Some of the iterations of it have increased in recent years for various reasons. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to go next, Paul. Thank you. I'm actually working on a project with Ohio IPL where we're looking at the possibility of sacred land trusts.
Yeah.
Looking at gathering. Part of the genesis of this is that churches are selling their camp properties.
Oh,
very often to developers, and are there ways to kind of increase the space sharing with religious traditions that don't necessarily have land, or even indigenous traditions who have had land taken away?
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you've come across any examples of that kind of work. Right now we're working with land trust law and that kind of stuff to try to learn as much as we can. So.
Yeah, I don't have any cases quite like that. It's just another case of everywhere I go, somebody has something new that I hadn't thought of. It's such a big topic, but it's interesting because, you know, if it's like a church camp or something, it's not exactly sacred space, but it's dedicated to one religion, you know, the Methodist camp or whatever. And now if it gets repurposed, it's going to retain some of that, and the sacred land that may have been taken from native tribes or something. That's an interesting wrinkle. And this common management literature is not all that helpful per se. It's a huge literature, but the amount of research or papers that are specifically about religious aspects is fairly small in that. So I don't even know in that large literature where there's much there. There's a database that you can search on that. I can share with you. It's in Indiana University, I think. You can keyword things in. There may be something there, but I don't know much about it, but it certainly fits under this broad umbrella. And so the principles pretty much, you know, that I've outlined probably would be effective in that context as well. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Paul. And also, thanks so much for coming back to share this with us a little bit midstream as you're continuing to work on this.
Halfway up the mountain. Right?
Yeah, right. So I've got a question about two variables that, that I'm not sure that I heard you touch on. One was about longevity.
Yeah.
How long these relationships last, if they have a life cycle. I'm thinking in particular in Columbus on the kind of the western edge heading into Bexley. There used to be a Presbyterian church, Westminster Pres, that had a synagogue attached with it. And I don't know what the arrangement was, but I mean, it was prominent as you drove down there. Yeah. And basically the church kind of dissolved or disappeared, and I don't know all the history there, but I just wondered about life cycles. And then The other variable is really about the difference between urban, suburban kinds of dynamics, where these things I would think would be far more prominent as opposed to more rural and isolated areas. And if you found examples of places where it would be surprising that people were actually sharing space because of just the setting, and it's, you know, not in a city, but a different kind of setting for them.
Well, I think all of my sites are urban. I tried to have geographic spread, Midwest, coasts, you know, smaller urban areas, but I don't have any rural sites per se. I think in rural areas you have space sharing going on because you might have a church that allows neighborhood groups or civic groups to use, so there's going to be space sharing anywhere and everywhere. In urban areas it's more intense and more widespread, broad, because there's just so many possibilities. There are so many groups that need space. So the urban-rural thing, I think you'd be surprised more is going on than we might think in rural areas. Certainly in urban areas with demographic shifts, there's a lot going on, and I focused on urban sites. The life cycle question, I think it just depends. Two of my sites, Beresheath of the Midwest goes back to the early 70s, and the Columbia, Maryland, 6 interfaith centers go back to the right about the 1970s, late 60s. So it just depends. Those go way back. Interfaith, the Tri-Faith Initiative in Omaha is fairly recent, 2006 or something like that. And then the kind of cycle that you're talking about, sometimes these things dissolve just because they run their course. So one group moves, one group sells, or whatever. I don't think there's one answer to that. There is a Sacred Partners. There's an organization that tracks this with arts groups that share space with churches. They've got a lot of data on that. And as I was looking through their cases, you know, some of them just dissolve or move on or what have you. It just really all depends. One interesting thing I've heard from several sites is, not several sites, but some, we were the first, or we're the only. And I always look at those and wonder, and sometimes you can say, yes, you're right, and sometimes maybe you're not. But some of these ones that go back, they may actually be the first one of its kind, but now others have followed suit. So there's some longevity here, but a lot of it is come and go depending on the circumstances, and they rise and end and so forth.
Thanks for your presentation. I appreciate it. I'm Trad, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. We've corresponded.
Yeah, very good.
I'm curious about the conflicts that do arise, and I'm also curious about such as the church in Memphis and the campus, where it seems to be somewhat intentional for the purposes of their brand or their theology of religions. And I was wondering if the conflicts that happen in those situations, if they differ from the conflicts that happen where it's more transactional or more business-like.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There's a sociological literature that has a lot of terms about exchange, negotiated exchange versus another kind of exchange. It's escaping me now. And one is very formal, you know, even legal, and the other is very informal. So which one of those is better in terms of an effective relationship? And there's a literature on that. I don't really see that either one is better. I think these can be very successful and satisfying relationships no matter how they organize them. So I don't think you need, I don't think, you'll have conflict in any situation, and you can avoid conflict in any situation. I think it depends on how these groups really enter the relationship and how it unfolds. So you'd think that if it's all written down and it's all very legal, you won't have any problems or you'll have less problems. I don't think that's the case. I mean, it hasn't been borne out in my sites, in my research sites. Now, in terms of the Memphis case you talked about, and specifically, say again what your interest was in that one. That's the one with the Ramadan, the space was used for Ramadan.
Well, I was struck by the response of the pastor.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned about if the church burns down.
Yes.
They'll have it. And it seemed to be that it was that allowing the Muslims to use the space was kind of part of their ministry in a sense, or part of their brand as this is who we are.
Yeah.
We let people do these things.
Absolutely, it is. When I ask individuals, why are you doing this? Often it's fulfilling our mission. This is our mission. And in this case, the founding pastor, who's now a retired pastor, this is what Jesus called us to do. These are our neighbors, period. These are our neighbors. These are our neighbors in need. The building right across the street, you know, he didn't even know about this until he read it in the paper. So this is their purpose, is to be neighbors. He does talk about a soft witness of love that might lead to a more verbal witness. This is a United Methodist congregation, but again, it's a kind of progressive evangelical, and you know, it's very, very interesting. If we have time, I'm going to show a very brief video about it that is just really inspiring. But if we don't have time, I can give you the link. But it is indeed seen as this is fulfilling our mission to allow this group to use this space. And Jesu Christo, same thing. They're very particular on who can use this space, but they see it as part of their mission, their calling to have the Jewish congregation use that space. So,
I'm going to give the mic to Linda. She has another question, but didn't the Memphis situation happen because there was an attack on the Muslim mosque? I vaguely remember this story, and my brother still lives in Memphis, so I'm thinking about this, and that this was the church that stepped up, and then they sort of, it sounded, at least in what I read about it, they made a theological case about being neighbors, and they caught, as I remember the story, hell from lots of UMC churches, not just from internal.
yeah, actually, this case was brought to my attention by one of my students here. Sent me this link and said, "Do you know about this?" I said, "No, I do, and I need to use this case." This was 2010, as I recall, but it was not prompted by an attack on this mosque because it wasn't built yet. My understanding of the situation was it was not prompted by any specific attack. You may want to check me on that, but that's not my recollection. What the pastor did was he read the newspaper, and he saw in the newspaper that there's this mosque being built at such and such an address, and he said, that's across the street from my church. That's how it started. He and the church put up a sign that says, Heartsong Church welcomes Memphis Islamic Center to the neighborhood. And the Muslims saw that sign, and that's how it started. Then later, the use of it, because the mosque was not built in time, then it led to that. But they started out just with that simple act of neighborly friendship. So I don't think it was prompted. Sadly, there may have been another case in Memphis, as it's been all over the country, but I think this was simply that act of neighborliness that really began it. And it is an inspiring story, so, yeah.
Paul, a lot of the examples you've been giving are very positive, you know, where the conflict was averted or people maybe avoided each other in a good way, you know, where they didn't get in each other's faces. But I'm thinking specifically about immigrant groups and immigration, and I'm thinking about what happened when Italian immigrants came, or Catholic, mostly Catholic, Italians came to the U.S., and the Irish Catholics were in charge of the church pretty much because they had gotten here sooner. So when the Italians came, they still sometimes they created their own ethnic parishes, but a lot of times that wasn't possible. So they did this. They did what they call creating basamento Catholics, which meant that the Italian Catholics got to worship in the basement, and the Irish Catholics worshipped upstairs, and not at the same time either.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether you found anything with immigration where maybe they were the same religion, and maybe they were even the same ethnicity, but some came sooner and some came later,
Yeah.
and so maybe they took responsibility for the newer group, but really didn't treat them
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah, the basement churches, also Puerto Ricans fall into that category. And that's what they were called, basement churches. And the social hierarchy was clear in the facilities hierarchy. You're in the basement. You're low, visually. Well, one of the cases that I haven't talked about that just is on record is it's a Chinese church in New York City, Chinese church, and what was the other? Hispanic church. And they shared a building, and they had to bring in outside arbitration and so forth. One of my cases from Chicago went to court to keep the building open for the groups. There's all kinds of heavily conflicted cases. Now, the ones that I've chosen here, most of it's minor stuff, but sometimes it moves up into, more conflictual relationship. So in my larger project, lots of really conflictual cases, extreme conflict, but I did focus on these, which for the most part are minor conflicts. Yeah. Okay.
Paul, thank you so much
Yeah.
for the presentation as well. I am curious, I'm not sure if you covered this and I missed it, but I'm curious, in your research, did you find that most traditions, did you find example on each tradition where they are trying to mix? I'm thinking, for instance, did you find some Christians who are borrowing space in a temple or in a mosque or in a Catholic church? I picked those three specifically because I know they're very, very strict on their space. Did you come across cases where those are opening up to be the host?
Yeah, and it has to do with legitimate uses and users of the space. And so some groups say, we are the only ones who can legitimately use this space. So you're not going to find mosques that would have another religious group using the prayer hall, okay? And it's rare, if ever, that you'll find a dedicated Catholic worship space being used by another religious group, somewhere else on the parish grounds maybe, okay? So certain groups are very particular about not allowing other groups. But a lot of cases where you can't use this sacred space on site, but you can use the parish hall or the social hall or the basement or whatever. So you're quite right that certain groups, that's part of defining who can use it and who can't use it.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
I'm not sure you have such a broad swath here that you can answer my question, but I'm certainly aware of shared arrangements that have had profound impacts on partners that started into the arrangement for very different reasons.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I'm trying to how to think about how broad is that kind of outcome, and what can you tell us about kind of the outcomes of what you're seeing out of these projects?
Yeah, does it begin with, say, a very practical, we're going to save money by sharing this space, and does it then develop into something more? That happens. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's just strictly business, which can work fine. But, in Omaha, Tri-Faith Initiative, it began with a parking lot. And it was as simple as that. When the one group, this was before they decided to have an interfaith campus, one of the congregations needed parking. And then there was an incident as you were talking about, there was an incident in that community where the synagogue came to the aid of the Muslim congregation. And those things move fairly quickly from practical need, parking, to let's do something together, make an interfaith statement, and co-locate. So that happens. I don't know how often it happens. It's pretty inspiring when I see it, but it does happen. The relationship evolves into something that was unanticipated.
The events of the last 2 years have sparked a new type of arrangement. For example, in Cincinnati, the chapel of Hebrew Union College and the local mosque have entered into a partnership that if either one of their facilities are damaged,
Right.
that then the partner can go and use the other facility during the time that they're rebuilding. And I'm wondering whether that's just evolved in the last 2 years. I'm wondering whether there's more of those sorts of examples emerging.
That happens all the time. A facility gets burned down or burned out or damaged, and they have to go somewhere. And a neighboring organization, congregation hosts them. It's often temporarily, and so that may last beyond that, or it may just be for that time, but that's quite common. I'd be interested to know if there's dedicated space there, and the symbols of the space that might be used in the Hebrew Union Chapel. Yeah. But no, that's pretty common. Yeah.
Have you gone to Portland yet, Oregon? One of our alums there. You need to talk to Julia Bingman, now Nielsen, pastoring a United Methodist Church in a Portland neighborhood, a denomination that was doing a church planting there. There are only seminaries in Chicago. It's kind of an evangelical conservative group. Came out as LGBT friendly, so the denomination stripped the ordination credentials from the two pastors planting the church. Julia knew them through a pastoral society. Well, just come and worship here.
Yeah.
They got their ordination through disciples over the last couple years, and now, as of 3 months ago, they've signed an agreement as a united congregation. So it's went from space sharing to kind of a full shift in both congregations.
Well, and that one of the reasons that I see is solidarity. Okay, we're going to enter into this arrangement out of solidarity, with you, and that sounds like partly what's going on there as well.
Paul, we're out of time for questions. Do you want to show the video as a way
If anybody wants a link, this Memphis case is very inspiring. There's a 5-minute video about that pastor and the Memphis Islamic Center. It's really something. So I can give the link to anybody who wants to see that. So,
Help me thank Dr. Numrich.
Thank you all. Thank you.
And good night.